Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Benny, Executive Director of the ABAA. Thank you for joining us today for Julia Child and Company, Delights at the Schlesinger Library, which is part of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America's Boston Virtual Book Fair. We hope you will visit the fair at abaa.org/VVF if you have not already. The fair runs through Saturday until 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Just a couple of notes. We are recording this session for later viewing. If you have questions or comments, we ask you to write them in the chat and we will try to answer them. There will be a Q&A at the end. It's our distinct pleasure to welcome Marylène Altieri. Marylène became Curator of Published and Printed Materials at Schlesinger Library, succeeding Barbara Haber in August 2004. At Schlesinger, she works to build the collections in the history of women in America, as well as the Culinary collection, both among the finest in the world. She has worked at Harvard Libraries for 40 years. She holds a BA in Modern European History with honors from the University of York, England, a master's degree in Modern European History from Harvard University, and a master's in Library and Information Science from Simmons University. Daughter of a French mother and an Italian father, she grew up in the Arthur Avenue Italian neighborhood in the Bronx, New York, and made frequent visits to Lyon, France with her mother's native city, and to Italy, experiences that made her a confirmed food lover. Today's tour of Julia Child's voluminous and fascinating papers is just one of several collections of prominent women in the world of food at the Schlesinger Library. Their papers are nestled in comprehensive collections of cookbooks, culinary periodicals, product pamphlets, and menus that give depth and context to the record of their achievements. Schlesinger's broader mission to document the lives of women in America further enhances their meaning and provides researchers with unparalleled resources. Marylène will introduce you to the range of these materials, with perhaps some timely recipes thrown in. Welcome and thank you very much, Marylène.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the Boston Virtual Book Fair. I look forward to attending this fair in person every year, and I often welcome fair folks to Schlesinger for tours, and I'm really missing that this year. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in because this is a fairly long presentation. I hope you'll enjoy. I will start with a brief introduction to Schlesinger Library to give you some background, and then I'll launch into our culinary collection and the papers of Julia Child. I'm going to share my screen now and show you my PowerPoint, which is right here. Hold on just a second. Having trouble getting the slideshow to start. There we go. Okay. I hope you can all see this. This is a view of Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America, which is a research library located on the campus of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study in Cambridge, which is part of Harvard University. Schlesinger Library is also part of the entity known as the Harvard Library, which comprises over 70 libraries at the university. Schlesinger houses one of the country's finest collections of resources for research on the history of women in America. Founded in 1943 at Radcliffe College, the Women's Archive, which was renamed in 1965 as the Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America, and there are Arthur and Elizabeth. It documents the experiences of women of the past and present for the future. It collects, houses, and preserves the historical record of American women acting both locally and globally. With roughly 4,000 unique manuscript collections, 150,000 printed volumes, and over 100,000 photographs, as well as thousands of periodicals and items of ephemera, the Schlesinger is the world's leading archive on the history of American women and women's organizations. The library's holdings are strong in women's rights and feminism, health and sexuality, work and family life, education and the professions, and culinary history and etiquette. Open to the public, the library normally welcomes all researchers who wish to use the collections, view exhibitions, and attend events. Currently, we are closed because of the pandemic, but our research services staff are hard at work providing digital access to our collections and answering reference questions remotely. I'm the library's curator of published and printed materials, and I and my colleagues continue the work of acquiring resources and interpreting them from home at this time. From a founding gift collection on the history of suffrage in 1943, the Women's Rights Collection, the library grew exponentially, especially during the women's movement of the 1960s. Well-known figures whose collections are in the library include writers Adrienne Rich, June Jordan, Cher Haidt, Dorothy West, and Ellen Willis, aviator Amelia Earhart, and cookbook author and television personality Julia Child, political activists Betty Friedan, Barbara Deming, Florence Kennedy, Pauli Murray, Shirley Graham Du Bois, and Angela Davis, artists Corita Kent and Judy Chicago, and historian Gerda Lerner, to name only a handful. Numerous records of diverse women's organizations are also housed at the library, including those of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, the National Organization for Women, NOW, the 9 to 5 National Association of Working Women, the Women's Educational and Industrial Union, hundreds of women's clubs of the 19th and 20th centuries, and settlement houses. We have collections documenting women's work in both world wars, work overseas with missions and international projects, women in political office, the law, medicine and science, education, health and hygiene, and many other endeavors.
Marylène?
Yes.
Sorry, it's Susan. It looks like the slide presentation is not advancing. Could you possibly make it a little bit larger on people's screen so all can see it? Yes,
this is perfect.
Good. Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your help, and I apologize to everyone for the delay.
Thank you.
So I'll continue. The bulk of the Schlesinger holdings document the lives of ordinary women and their families in America going back to the 18th century. The collections include the papers of women of diverse backgrounds and viewpoints at all stages of life, particularly diaries and personal correspondence, but also including photograph albums, scrapbooks, and now even hard drives, websites, blogs, and email files. We're working hard to represent an ever greater diversity of voices and stories. We're also home to the official records of Radcliffe College and the papers of many Radcliffe women. We welcome inquiries from anyone looking for a home for materials documenting the lives of women. We're also pioneering in the field of born digital collections, most notably in the ongoing Me Too digital media collection, which will document the digital footprint of the hashtag #MeToo movement and the accompanying political, legal, and social battles in the United States. The material in the collection dates from 2017 with the popularization of the #MeToo hashtag, which was originally created in 2007 by Tarana Burke, and will end when hashtag #MeToo activity subsides. Our online archive at this moment contains more than 32 million tweets, 1,100 web pages, and thousands of articles reflecting a range of perspectives. 2020 was supposed to be a banner year for the library, which was begun to document the history of suffrage. And we had very big plans for the 100th anniversary of the adoption of the 19th Amendment. Of course, the pandemic has upended everything. The library has been observing the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment with a variety of activities under the title of the Long 19th Amendment Project, supported by a grant from the Mellon Foundation and a generous donation by John Wright Ingraham. You can visit the website that we have constructed as part of this project, which includes exhibits, digitized archival data sets, and teaching tools. You can also listen online to a series of talks and panels called Voting Matters that were originally to be delivered live, but you can listen to them on the Radcliffe Institute's website, and you can also sign up for notifications of events from the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study there also. And now on to Schlesinger's culinary collection. Our renowned culinary collection, currently including over 30,000 books, 4,500 pamphlets, over 2,500 menus, hundreds of periodicals, and dozens of manuscript collections, grew from a kernel of resources in the Woman's Archive that documented women's domestic life and work. Among treatises on domestic economy and housekeeping manuals, magazines for women and girls, health and hygiene pamphlets, and records of home economics and consumer organizations, there also developed a core collection of historic 19th and 20th century cookbooks. These were seen as necessary for building a picture of women's lives in the home. As the Woman's Archive began to attract attention, and right around the time it moved into the current building, librarians at Harvard's Widener Library offered their cookbook collection to the archive at Radcliffe as a way to consolidate resources. This was a superb collection, mostly assembled by Marietta Greeno, who was married to a Harvard professor, Chester Greeno, and had a deep interest in historic cookbooks. She even had her own book plate showing an enormous flaming hearth. These books were shelved in the level D of Widener Library, that is 4 levels below ground, next to mortuary science. Few people used them. When the 1,500 books were received at the Women's Archive in 1961, some feminist alumnae of Radcliffe College sneered, "Cookbooks? We were trying to get away from cookbooks." But even as the second wave women's movement took off, their research value was soon recognized, and the library continued to build the culinary collection. The significant gift came in 1974, the Cookbook Collection of Samuel and Narcissa Chamberlain, known for their gourmet magazine column, Clementine in the Kitchen, books, and culinary calendars illustrated with Samuel's stunning photogravures of France and other countries. Samuel was also a noted printmaker whose prints are in the collection of the Boston Public Library. Their book collection included hundreds of 18th to 20th century cookbooks from continental Europe and England, as well as the United States. But the greatest boost to Schlesinger's culinary collection came from its acquisition of the papers and personal library of Julia Child. During the 1950s, Julia Child and 2 French collaborators, Simone Beck and Louisette Berthold, were hard at work on a major book aiming to make French cuisine attainable by American cooks. Beck and Berthold had brought out a small book for Americans in 1952, but were not satisfied with the results. Oops, I seem to have skipped a slide here somewhere. Oh, never mind. Julia and Paul Child lived in Paris for several years, starting in 1948, where the 3 women started a cooking school for Americans called L'École des Trois Gourmands. Paul designed this badge that they wore, and Louisette Berthold stitched them. Then Paul embarked on a series of USIA cultural attaché postings around Europe. This slide actually shows you a little listing of the skills that they were teaching at this school, the things that they thought a good cook should know how to do. This is in the papers of Julia Child. And there is the book that Louisette and Simone had published, a little spiral bound thing. And there are Paul and Julia in Paris. And subsequently, they moved around Europe, including Marseille, Berlin, and Oslo. There's Julia on skis. Julia had connected with an American freelance editor and book agent, Avis Devoto, with whom she corresponded extensively during the 1950s as she continued to work on the book. Avis Devoto lived in Cambridge and introduced Julia Child to Schlesinger Library when she and Paul moved to Cambridge in 1961. Julia eventually decided to give her book collection and all of her papers to the Schlesinger Library, signing an agreement in 1976 and proceeding to make regular deposits over the next decades. The final delivery came to the library when she moved permanently to Santa Barbara in 2000. As her Cambridge kitchen was being dismantled for reassembly at the National Museum of American History in Washington, our archivists were also at her house packing the last cartons. The papers of Julia Child at Schlesinger are an absolutely extraordinary collection comprising over 150 linear feet of material that documents the life and achievements of this groundbreaking woman in minute detail. This is the table of contents to the finding, or one of two finding aids to her papers. Julia's papers cover everything from her first days with Paul in Ceylon to her final episodes of Julia and Jacques cooking at home. Included are her vast personal and business correspondence, diaries, scrapbooks, photographs, drafts of her books, scripts for her television shows, fan mail, extensive recipe research files, contracts, awards, audio and video recordings, and memorabilia, including her 1965 Emmy Award statuette and one of her copper pots and a whisk. And here you see Bill Cosby presenting the Emmy Award to Julia. Julia Child's book collection came to the library in regular installments from 1976 through the 1990s, while she continued to live in Cambridge. The books left in her Santa Barbara apartment, to which she retired and where she died, came to the library just recently with the help of the Julia Child Foundation. Every book given by Julia can be found in our online catalog by searching on the phrase Child, Julia, former owner. Julia kept a significant number of historic works at her Cambridge home for years, since she referred to them frequently, but she generously shared them with interested researchers. Barbara Ketchum Wheaton was one such person. Wheaton had used the Greenough collection in Widener D level before it moved to Schlesinger, while working on her 1983 magnum opus, Savoring the Past, the French Kitchen and Table from 1300 to 1789, a pioneering scholarly work of culinary history. Unable to travel to France from Cambridge for research due to having 3 small children at home, Wheaton was given keys to the Child home on Irving Street, where she happily delved into the hard-to-find works that Julia had purchased in Paris and brought back with her. Wheaton, who also taught a legendary seminar called Reading Historic Cookbooks, is now semi-retired, but still very active as a culinary historian and database creator. She recalls that those classic books were shelved near Julia's desk at arm's length. Julia's gift, widely announced, opened a floodgate of further donations. Schlesinger Library raised additional money to add purchased books to the collection, and it grew fast. Groups such as the Culinary Historians of Boston and the New England Culinary Guild began to meet and hold events at the library. The curator of books at Schlesinger in this era, my predecessor, Barbara Haber, was herself a culinary historian and who published 2 outstanding books and built the collection assiduously, using many stratagems to garner financial and academic support. Her ardent advocacy helped overcome some skepticism about this collecting area. Incidentally, she gave a fascinating talk just last night on the question of whether food has a gender. So she is still very active also. Scholars took growing interest in culinary history, though few university faculty had the expertise to guide their research. Wheaton served as honorary curator of the culinary collection at Schlesinger and was a de facto advisor for countless dissertations, as well as a curatorial advisor for acquisitions. Further significant collections of historic cookbooks came to the Git Library as gifts during that time and added even more depth and range to the holdings. Those of Carl Sontheimer and Sophie Coe and the American Institute of Wine and Food, Eleanor Lowenstein collection. Sontheimer, developer of the Cuisinart, grew up in France and began collecting books around age 10. He amassed an enormous collection of rare culinary works, several thousand of which were donated to Schlesinger by his widow, Shirley, in 2003. Sophie Coe, an anthropologist and Radcliffe College alumna who joined her husband Michael in studying Mayan civilization, became an authority on the history of chocolate. She collected cookbooks all over the world during their travels, including a significant number of manuscript cookbooks and community or charitable cookbooks. During her lifetime, she donated her collection of community cookbooks to the library. And after her sadly premature death in 1994, her husband gave the rest of her vast culinary library to Schlesinger. It included her manuscript cookbooks, many rare published books, including notably titles in Russian. And our Russian holdings were further increased with donations from food history scholars Joyce Tumry and Lynn Visson. Julia Child brokered yet another very significant gift, the rare book collection of the American Institute of Wine and Food. The Institute, founded in California by Julia Child, Robert Mondavi, and Richard Graff in 1981, had acquired the book collection of Eleanor Lowenstein, whose New York bookshop, the Corner Bookstore, specialized in historic cookbooks, and the library of gastronome André Simon. They intended to establish a reading room to make them accessible. Julia was not pleased that they failed to do this, leaving these important resources stored in boxes for over a decade. Finally, she insisted that the collection be transferred to research libraries at the University of California, San Diego, and Schlesinger. Nearly 600 rare and fine works were in the Schlesinger group. We've also received gifts of Swedish and Greek cookbooks, the Chinese cookbook collections of Grace Zia Chu and Barbara Trop. In 2006, we purchased the James C. Witten collection of vegetarian cookbooks. And as scholarly interests in American foodways have increasingly reflected Mexican and Southern American influences, I've been making a concerted effort to diversify from our Eurocentric emphasis, acquiring books from those regions, in particular, the prolific works of the Mexican cooking teacher, writer, and entrepreneur Josefina Velázquez de León. So our library, which collects mostly American historical resources, also has an international culinary collection. It's a perfect reflection of the many food traditions that have influenced our immigrant nation, and also of the wide-ranging publications that have been and will continue to be important to scholars of food history. Although the culinary collection could stand alone, we like to think that this culinary collection at Schlesinger is made unique and is tremendously enriched by existing in an unparalleled context of documentation of every aspect of women's lives and domestic life, a context that is not replicated in any other library. Our manuscript collections include thousands of women's letters and diaries in which food is often discussed, and records of women's voluntary organizations deeply involved with food. We hold hundreds of periodicals from the 19th to the 21st century, everything from Godey's Ladies Book and the Boston Cooking School magazine to Martha Stewart Living and Cherry Bomb. And the amount of culinary content in women's magazines and journals such as McCall's or Red Book or Ladies' Home Journal is huge. Our 4,500 plus collection of product pamphlets, these little recipe books that came with new appliances or in a box with gelatin or flour or other food products, many dating from the late 1800s and early 1900s, are a treasure trove of food information, as well as of images of everything from kitchen design to women's fashions to batterie de cuisine. Beside their culinary uses, they're sought by graphic artists, architects, interior designers, material culture historians, students of the history of the family, and business or advertising historians. In addition, we have collections of menus and other printed ephemera. The manuscript collections that we have at Schlesinger that relate to women in the culinary field, besides the papers of Julia Child, include Eleanor Lowenstein, whom I've already mentioned, and we also have the records of her store, the Corner Bookshop. The records of the Window Shop, which was started in Cambridge by a group of women who were refugees from the Nazis to provide employment opportunities for other women. The papers of Dion Lucas there on the right, who was a cooking teacher and cookbook writer in New York in the 1940s. She was originally British. came to America, and she was one of the first television chefs. She had a TV show that predated that of Julia Child. We have papers of Simone Beck, who is shown there with Julia, Avis Devoto in the center with Julia, Elizabeth David, the British food writer, Roberta Kalachowski, who is a vegetarian cookbook author and animal rights activist, the Rombauer Becker family, Irma Rombauer, creator of The Joy of Cooking, Christine Frederick in the center image, who was a consumer rights advocate and kitchen design advocate, who is responsible, among other things, for the concept of standard counter heights and continuous counter height around the kitchen and other efficiency measures. The writer MFK Fisher, Stella Standard, Zarela Martinez in the center, whose collection came to us recently. She founded the restaurant Zarela's and in New York and popularized Mexican regional cuisines in America. Jean Wade Rindblaub with the hat and net there, who was an advertising executive. I'll talk more about her later. Peg Bracken, the I Hate to Cook book. The menu collection that I mentioned earlier, menu collection of Lee Orloff, who spent 25 years living in Paris and collecting menus from starred restaurants, 1,300 of them to date. And coming soon, the papers of Lydia Bastianich. Organizational records that we have include the records of Les Dames d'Escoffier, the Epicurean Club of Boston, the records of the Fishermen's Wives of Gloucester, and the records of Women in Food Information Network, among others. I always love to point out that Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and Julia Child's show, The French Chef, both burst onto the American scene in the same year, 1963. And at Schlesinger, the papers of Betty Friedan and those of Julia Child sit side by side, and they are both Smith College graduates, I might add. Finally, a brief word about digitization. We're just wrapping up a project with the Pine Tree Foundation to digitize most of our manuscript cookbooks, about 120 to date, and they will become available as digital files on the Foundation's website, which you see an image of here. I want to give you a quick series of images of some of our more notable cookbooks before I go back to talking some more about the papers of Julia Child. I'll just quickly go through these slides. These are two of our very oldest cookbooks, 1562 on the left and 1610 on the right. Early works on food in Latin and Italian, both of them written by doctors. This is one of the earliest cookbooks published by a woman, Anna Wecker's Kochbuch, which was originally published in 1598. We hold a 1679 edition. This is another early cookbook by a woman, Margaret Schellhammer's Brandenburgische Kochbuch, with a beautiful frontispiece. Here are a couple of English cookbooks, The Queen-like Closet and The British Jewel, which has a very lengthy title page showing you all the different things that women were expected to be able to do in the home besides cooking. This even includes a method of restoring to life people drowned or in any other manner suffocated. This is one of many cookbooks we hold that have recipes written into them by hand. And here is a recipe for something to cure consumption. So there are medical recipes as well as cooking recipes in some of these older cookbooks. Here's a great recipe for making walnut ketchup, which is made with walnuts and anchovies and nutmeg and mace and is left to ferment in a large crock before it's used. And the recipe is written in this beautiful hand and dated 20th July, 1781. And it's just written onto the front paste down inside the front cover of an old cookbook. There are a couple more beautiful illustrated frontispieces. The one on the left is interesting. It's Hannah Glass's Art of Cookery, which was kind of like the Joy of Cooking of England, began to be published in the 1740s and continued to appear long after she died in successive new editions. But this edition has this interesting frontispiece where you see the lady of the house sitting with the probably very expensive cookbook on her little table, and she's written out one of the recipes by hand and is giving it to the cook, who will then take that piece of paper into the kitchen and instruct the other cooks on what to do. This cook taking the piece of paper is probably the only literate member of the staff, perhaps, and she would have gone in and read those instructions aloud. So this little frontispiece tells us a great deal about the transmission of books and recipes in 18th century England. Here is one of the classic French cookbooks, the Cookbook of Kahem, showing these two macho guys who were the type of people who were cooking in aristocratic households in those days. Late in the 19th century, around the 1870s, chromolithography became available and could be produced inexpensively in cookbooks, and you began to see cookbooks having color illustrations in them. Here's a wonderful book that's in our collection by Mrs. Marshall, who was a British woman entrepreneur. She taught cooking, had a school, she had a shop where she sold all her own products. She even toured the United States giving cooking lessons and put out many books. This one of ices is really stunning, and the picture doesn't quite capture the silver on the cover. It's all silver gilt, and I love the image of the polar bear. Here are a couple of iconic American cookbooks. On the left, Amelia Simmons' American Cookery. This is an 1808 edition. It first came out in 1796, and we have that edition, but I couldn't photograph it because it's too tightly bound. I couldn't get it to lie flat. But the 1808 edition was part of the American Institute of Wine and Food gift to us. And this is the first book published in America by an American. There were cookbooks that had been reprinted from English cookbooks that appeared before this, but this is the first genuinely American cookbook. And then on the right is Lydia Maria Child's American Frugal Housewife. She was an abolitionist and reformer as well as a cook, and she directed her cookbooks not to the wealthy aristocratic households, but to people who had very slender means. The Woman's Suffrage Cookbook here is an example of a fundraising cookbook, of which we have thousands. This cookbook was published obviously to raise money for the movement to gain women's suffrage. It features a number of recipes for something called gems, which are kind of like a shallow cupcake. And there were special pans for making them called gem pans. And you see several recipes, including multiple recipes for graham gems here. This is another example of a cookbook with contributed recipes. It's the Household Treasure, which was published in Milwaukee in the 1880s. And you can see that this page was heavily used, the cakes page here with the food stains all over it. A lot of our books have food stains in them. But many of these community cookbooks included blank pages where you could write in your own recipes. And interestingly, the recipe here is written in German. So Milwaukee, of course, being an area where there was a lot of German immigration, it's likely that this was owned by a woman who spoke German. But some of the other recipes are written in English. So she had learned English, but she had still recorded some of her recipes in German. So these books really tell us a lot about women's lives. Here are a couple of Jewish cookbooks. On the left, a really magnificent cover on this Jewish cookbook that was published in Mainz, Germany in the 1890s. And there are probably very few copies of it left after the Nazis completed their destruction of Jewish books in Germany, but we're very fortunate to have a copy in Schlesinger Library. And on the right, the Settlement Cookbook, which isn't specifically a Jewish cookbook per se. It includes all kinds of recipes, but it does have a number of Jewish recipes. And of course, these books were, settlement books were produced to help immigrant women adjust to life in America. So they provided a great many details of how to organize a household. But interestingly, this Settlement Cookbook has kosher recipes in it as well as non-kosher and all sorts of other American and European recipes. It began to appear in the teens of the 20th century, and this is a 1920s version that has a really charming cover on it. Here are some of our Southern cookbooks. First, Mrs. Fisher, What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, which is the first cookbook published in America by a person who had been enslaved. It was published in 1881, and interestingly, it was printed by the Women's Cooperative Printing Works in San Francisco, which was an all-women-run business. And Mrs. Fisher became very famous for her cooking and won many prizes. But she was not literate, so this book was dictated by her, and there are some very funny errors in it as a result of that, including one recipe that says it's a recipe for jumberly, but that's actually a recipe for jambalaya. Here is the Bluegrass Cookbook of 1904, which is probably the first Southern cookbook to credit African-American cooks by name for their recipes. So even though it was produced by a white woman, there are numerous recipes in it that are credited to African-American cooks, and beautiful portraits of them that were taken by famous photographer Alvin Langdon Coburn. It's a very signal book in culinary history. Here's another image from it. One of our vegetarian cookbooks, as I showed you before, and on the right, a book that came out during the war that gives a lot of recipe substitutions. So there was a shortage of sugar, there was a shortage of cooking fats, shortages of meat. So the recipes in this are actually pretty healthful recipes and very similar to what we're trying to do currently in our eating. And it's interesting to go back in time and see what people did in times of shortage with food substitutions. We have a great many community cookbooks and ethnic cookbooks of all kinds. On the left, one of the earlier soul food cookbooks. It came out in the 1960s. So Armenian recipes in the center, and on the right, a Finnish American cookbook that is actually published with parallel text, Finnish and English on each page in columns. Here are some of the women's organization cookbooks, and these we collect assiduously because they not only document cooking in America, but they also document the volunteer work that American women were doing in massive numbers before they all began to work outside the home for income. And a lot of these cookbooks will contain a history of the organization and the lists of its members and the causes that were supported by them. Women raised enormous amounts of money across the country for churches, schools, hospitals, all sorts of civic organizations. And this is a way of documenting their work as well as documenting food. Here's one of our periodicals, Boston Cooking School magazine, and one of the early issues of Gourmet from the first year of its existence, 1941, when it was a magazine that promoted hard liquor and hunting and fishing and all sorts of other pursuits more of interest probably to men than women. A menu from New Orleans, it's part of our menu collection, and one of the many boxes of our culinary pamphlets. And finally, my favorite cookbook in the collection, the two different editions of it here, this wonderful little Eskimo cookbook, which is only about 3 by 4 inches in size, and first was published in 1952 by students living on an island, Sarashef Island, in the village of Shishmaref. And this is a very poignant cookbook because this island is gradually disappearing under the rising waters caused by climate change. And the government is trying to get people to evacuate to the mainland, but they haven't provided any funds for them to build a new village. So people are still there, but they can no longer hunt and fish the way they used to. And they can no longer make most of the dishes that are documented in this little cookbook, which is probably the only thing that was ever published on this island. And this last recipe is especially poignant, the fermented walrus recipe, because it calls for burying walrus meat down in the permafrost, and the permafrost is not there anymore. It has melted to a degree that the ground is even unstable, and they have sinkholes now, and it's a really dire situation on this island. So this cookbook is a link to a way of life that is disappearing, and it's maybe only documented in this book. So thank you for looking at all of those. And I want to go back now and talk a little bit more about some of the other people who worked with Julia Child and whose papers are sitting with her papers at Schlesinger Library. And the first is Avis Devoto. Avis had great prescience, not only about publishing, but also about archiving. And we owe her a big debt of gratitude. She was married to the scholar and writer Bernard Devoto. She worked in publishing as a manuscript scout for Houghton Mifflin and Knopf, and then she worked at Radcliffe in the dean's office. During the 1950s, Avis and Julia became collaborators on the manuscript of Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and also devoted pen pals. Julia sent Avis every draft of the chapters for comments. I love this picture of the two of them. Avis went to visit Julia in Paris, and there they are at one of those bookstalls on the Seine. And you can see the seams in their stockings in this picture. Avis steered the manuscript to its eventual publication, but so many things beside the manuscript came up in their letters. Because of Avis's chronic anemia and her husband's very limited palate, she confessed to Julia that her own cooking consisted of little other than red meat. She also wrote about her two sons, about life in Cambridge, about Bernard's work, and about her reactions to the politics of the day. Julia wrote to Avis about life in France, Paul's work, the child's outrage over Paul being summoned for interrogation in Washington in 1955. Both Julia and Avis ranted constantly about Senator McCarthy and 1950s America in their letters, with Julia venting particularly about her irascible, virulently ultra-conservative father. Julia and Paul separately sent Avis heartfelt condolences at Bernard's sudden death in 1958. Their letters positively crackle. You can read these marvelous letters in Joan Reardon's book, As Always, Julia. Avis recognized the value of her correspondence with Julia, and because she worked at Radcliffe, she was fully aware of the mission of Schlesinger to preserve women's voices. And it was she who suggested to Julia in the late 1960s that they place their correspondence at Schlesinger. Avis's papers also contain correspondence with publishers and other writers, including Elizabeth David, who I'll speak about more later, and extensive drafts of chapters of mastering that supplement those in Julia's papers. Next is Simone Beck, who was Julia Child's French co-author and always referred to as Simca. We have a wonderful collection of her papers. She was as tireless as Julia, possessed of iron discipline and a firm knowledge of cooking techniques. The daughter of a wealthy family who did not need to work or even to cook, she nonetheless had a passion for cooking and developed a vast repertoire of classic French cuisine. Many of the recipes in Mastering were originally her recipes, and her papers include an early handwritten notebook of her own recipes, which is astounding for its simplicity and bare bones approach. Simca struggled mightily with Julia's insistence on making the instructions extremely detailed and was downright dismissive of Julia's endless testing to ensure that their recipes would work with American ingredients. Nevertheless, she was as determined as Julia to create the best cookbook possible, and she braved hurdles such as writing in English and doing book tours in America. Here are Julia and Simone in their efforts to learn how to make a proper French baguette. Simone eventually came around to Julia's meticulous approach and precision, particularly in developing this famously detailed recipe for baguettes that appears in volume 2 of Mastering. Here's a little chart that Julia made up based on the gentleman, Monsieur Calvel, who you saw in the previous picture, on his work studying how to make bread. And here is some of Julia's notes on different types of American flour and how much protein and gluten and fat content they have. Simca and her husband, Jean Fischbacher, allowed Julia and Paul to build a home on their property in the south of France so that they could continue having a life in France after Paul's official work in France ended. Her papers at Schlesinger offer much additional material on mastering and materials relating to her own further books. She published 2 books of her own and came to America on her book tours. Her papers also contain several years' worth of full lesson sets of lesson plans, for the cooking school that she founded with Julia in Paris, the École des Trois Gourmands. And here's one of her cooking lessons, and you can see how she's corrected and marked it up further and done all kinds of work on it. The British writer Elizabeth David, like Julia, broke free from her origins to find her true self. There are interesting parallels between them. She was born in 1913, only a year later than Julia. Like Julia, she was the daughter of a politically conservative father. He was a member of Parliament. Rejecting her proper British upbringing, she left home young, traveled, and lived all over Europe, Greece, and North Africa, and during the Second World War lived openly with a married man on a sailboat. They ended up being detained in Italy on suspicion of espionage. Unlike Julia, she had affairs and a very short-lived marriage to Anthony David. But it's the historical coincidence of her work in Britain mirroring Julia's work at virtually the same time in France that strikes us. Her first book, A Book of Mediterranean Food, published in 1950, rejected the dreary British post-war diet and proposed the delights of sunnier cuisines. Her subsequent books on French provincial and Italian food strove to lift British eating to higher levels of quality and enjoyment. Like Julia, she drew on her travels and unconventionally peripatetic life and promoted continental and Mediterranean attitudes to food. She was as recognized for her writing style and her scholarship as for her cooking. In addition to writing regularly for periodicals and publishing several more books, she opened her own kitchen equipment shop in London. Elizabeth David published a glowing review of Mastering when it appeared. She and Julia met in 1963 while Julia was traveling to promote her book, and they developed a deep mutual admiration. Nancy Verdi Barr, in her book Backstage with Julia, tells the poignant story of their last meeting in 1992 when David was in failing health. Julia, in England to attend the annual Oxford Symposium on Cookery, took time out to visit Elizabeth David in the hospital. Elizabeth David begged Julia to get her some edible food. Julia promptly went out and purchased foie gras, caviar, and champagne, which she sneaked into the hospital for a secret picnic. Elizabeth David died just a short time later. We acquired David's very rich papers in 2003. One can't study the transformation of food in post-World War II era without looking at both David and Child. And finally, we have a further extraordinary link at Schlesinger between or among Julia, Elizabeth, and Avis. Here's a postcard from Julia to Elizabeth David. It was Avis Devoto who prepared the American edition of Elizabeth David's book on Italian food in 1958. We have all the related correspondence between them. And here's a letter from Avis Devoto to Elizabeth David talking about the edits that she is making on the book. And we also have a working copy that they shared back and forth, sending it by mail back and forth from Cambridge to England, where you can see all of Avis's markings in the book, and then Elizabeth David inserting further passages that are clipped onto the pages. We have now digitized this book, and we removed the paper clips, which were rusting, and worked out a way to keep those added pieces of paper in place. On this postcard from Avis to Elizabeth David, she mentions that she and Julia are looking forward to reading David's forthcoming article in The Spectator, and she also mentions cooking a recipe from David's Le Creuset cookbook, which we also have. And here is the Le Creuset cookbook. Elizabeth David was selling Le Creuset pots in her London shop, and she produced a little cookbook to go with them. And here's the recipe that Avis referred to in the postcard, the shin of beef stewed in red wine, which Avis says is a family favorite. So the papers of Elizabeth David also contain a lot of correspondence with Julia Child. Schlesinger not only represents many other culinary women, but women who pioneered in countless other fields and did work that deeply influenced domestic life. We recently acquired the papers of Jean Wade Rindlaub, who lived from 1904 to 1991. She was one of the first women to reach a high position in the world of Madison Avenue advertising, beginning in the 1930s at the firm of Batten, Barton, Durstein, and Osborne, known as BBDO, which is the firm that inspired the TV series Mad Men. She specialized in advertising directed at women. Rindlaub's advertising accounts included food companies such as General Mills, United Fruit, and Campbell's Soup, for whom she produced prolific quantities of ad copy. She was the voice behind Betty Crocker and introduced advertising innovations such as market research panels that became standard practice. She became one of the most influential promoters of processed foods at the same time that Julia was working to wean American cooks from their canned goods and cake mixes. How rich a picture we can gain of their era from their papers being side by side at Schlesinger. And finally, Paul Child. Yes, there are men's papers at Schlesinger too. They are often included in women's or family collections. Paul Child looms large as a personality in his own right and occupies an important role in Julia's life story. I sometimes think we should call our collection the Julia and Paul Child papers. Bob Spitz, in his biography of Julia, Dearie, builds on extensive interviews with Paul's family and spotlights the fascinating story of Paul's life. He and his twin brother, Charlie, or Charles, lost their father when they were infants. Reared by an artistic and unconventional mother in Cambridge and Newton, Mass., he traveled widely and tried his hand at many trades and occupations, including carpentry, stevedoring, and teaching art, while honing his skills in photography and painting. His friends included renowned photographers such as Edward Steichen and Ansel Adams. Women played an enormous role in his life. He was greatly influenced by his mother and then by Edith Kennedy, the cultured, artsy mother of one of his Avon Old Farm School students, with whom he lived for over a decade on Shepherd Street in Cambridge before World War II. He was still mourning Edith's death of heart disease in 1942 when he first met Julia during World War II in Ceylon. And here he is doing what he did there, which was to organize the map room. An older worldly man, he was at first quite intimidating to Julia, but he introduced her to high culture, fine food and wine, supporting her teaching and writing, and eventually, in his retirement, becoming her amanuensis. He helped Julia become Julia. Their relationship was a charming love story that continues to delight us today. Most significantly for us, his closeness to his twin brother resulted in a steady stream of detailed letters that document his life and Julia's from the 1940s to the 1970s. His photographs, which numbered 28,000 at last count, provide the iconography and the visual record of the Julia story. As official set photographer and full-time off-camera assistant, he was indispensable during her television years. During his lifetime, he received little acknowledgement of his tremendous gifts. Bob Spitz tells of the Boston food writer, Cheryl Julian, visiting their Cambridge house once, where she was astounded by the striking paintings hanging everywhere. "Whose are they?" she asked. Paul replied quietly that they were his. Cheryl exclaimed, "Why has no one written about you?" Some of Paul's photographs have now been published in the book France is a Feast. Julia's life could not have been so multifaceted, nor her papers so rich, were it not for the extraordinary contribution by Paul. Here's one of Paul's letters from Paris with a marvelous drawing of a restaurant in which they had eaten and a full description for his brother of the meal. This is an interesting piece of paper. It's just a little piece of memo paper in Julie's papers. And it's a note from Paul to Julie, as he calls her. And in it is a list of suggested titles for her television show, none of which is The French Chef. But he had come up with all these suggestions for other names, Cuisine at Home, Kitchen Française, Gourmet Pleasures, Cooking Chez Vous. And this little piece of paper is captured in Julia's papers. Here's another letter to his brother where he describes the grueling daily schedule of filming the show. And this is a schedule for a show day showing how everything was planned down to the minute by Julia and Paul together. Here's one of Paul's sketches for the filming of the omelette episode. So he made a sketch of the countertop and has lists of all the things that are needed, all of which they brought from home for the filming of the early days when there was no studio kitchen at WGBH. And there they are at their home, 103 Irving Street in Cambridge. And finally, here's an image of the book, Frances a Feast. I'm going to wrap it up now. This gathering of resources around the papers of Julia Child provides an unparalleled context in which to examine Julia's life and achievements and the revolution in food she is credited with launching. Schlesinger's collection documents Julia Child not only as a famous cooking personality, but as a revolutionary woman. And at Schlesinger, she joins the rank of legions of other revolutionary women. I'll end by sharing this wonderful birthday sonnet that Paul Child wrote for Julia in 1961. Oh, Julia, Julia, cook and nifty wench, whose unsurpassed quenelles and hot soufflés, whose English, Norse, and German, and whose French are all beyond my piteous powers to praise, whose sweetly rounded bottom and whose legs, whose gracious face, whose nature temperate, are only equaled by her scrambled eggs. Accept from me, your ever-loving mate, this acclamation, shaped in 14 lines, whose inner truth belies its outer sight. For never were there foods, nor were there wines, whose flavor equals yours for sheer delight. O luscious dish, O gustatory pleasure, you satisfy my taste buds beyond measure. Thank you.
That was so fun. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, I have one more thing to share with you. And this is an image from Amelia Simmons' American Cookery book of 1796. And it's a timely recipe because it's her recipe for roast turkey. The image is a little fuzzy. I apologize for that because I had to enlarge it. But you will see at the end of the paragraph in the center of the page, it tells you to serve the turkey with cranberry sauce. And this is 1796, the first printed suggestion of serving cranberry sauce with turkey. So I thought you would enjoy seeing that in the run up to Thanksgiving Day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to take a couple of questions?
I would love to take questions. Yes, absolutely.
Great. So there are a couple that have already come through, and I would also encourage any of the attendees to use the chat function to pose any questions. One that has come through already is someone wanted to know the name of the database that's being worked on, and also where will they be able to find it?
I mentioned Barbara Ketchum-Wheaton's database. It's called the Sifter. And it was just introduced over the summer for the first time. She's been working on it for decades, but she introduced it at the Oxford Symposium on Food. And I think if you go to their website, Oxford Symposium on Food, you may find some information about it. It hasn't actually gone up publicly yet. She's still working on it, but she did a presentation about it. And there may be some more information there. But what it is a really amazing thing. She has taken historic cookbooks and created a database of all the elements of the cookbook. So she has captured all the food terminology, all the equipment that's mentioned, like a saucepan or whisk or whatever implements are being discussed. The ingredients, of course, all the food ingredients and whatever is said about where to get them and what season to get them in. She's captured the information about the publishers of these cookbooks, how many copies were disseminated, all sorts of other details. And she's created an index so that you can look up a term and find which books it appears in, or you can take a whole concept like, or a cooking technique like sauteing and trace it back through history. It's going to be a phenomenal resource.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, really terrific thing.
So also, one of our guests would like to know about the fabulous greeting cards and invitations that Julia created over the years. Do you have them in your archives?
Right, we do. It's mostly a Valentine that they did every year. And this was something they did in lieu of Christmas cards. So they annually, Paul would design these Valentines and they would send them out to their friends. And there are examples in the collection, and some of them have been digitized. So you can actually find digital views of them. One of the most famous ones is the one of that they sent when they were posted to Berlin. No, it was Bonn, not Berlin. And they were living in some awful suburban apartment building, and really bare bones apartment that had been provided to them. They're sitting in the bathtub, and it has, horrible tile around it, and it's this really funky old bathtub, and they're sitting together in a bubble bath and saying, wish you were here, in a bubble coming out of their mouths, and it's just priceless. I had another Valentine in my slideshow. But those are in our collection, yes.
Great. And what about the papers from her last years of her life when she moved to Santa Barbara? Do you have those, or are those elsewhere?
She didn't really produce very much at that point.
I see.
We got the books that she had in her apartment, but she had basically, slowed down to a degree that there wasn't much. But we have just about everything. I think the Julia Child Foundation may still have some material also that hasn't been transferred. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think we have the bulk of what she did.
What about her years working as a spy? Do you have anything on that, or is that a little bit too classified?
She didn't actually give us any material that documents that she was a spy. She worked in Ceylon, mostly as a file clerk. And Paul was doing various things there, and we don't have correspondence from those years. All we have is retrospective. So when they were writing letters in the 50s, some of that came up in the letters that they wrote subsequently.
I see. Another attendee is wanting to know, has anyone prepared a history or analysis of all of the manuscript or extra recipes added in a variety or genre of fundraiser cookbooks?
Not that I am aware of. I mean, in our collection alone, we probably have 6,000 or 7,000 community cookbooks, many of which have handwritten recipes in them. Now, what we've done is, as we catalog these, every one of them has an individual cataloging record in our online catalog, which is called Hollis, and which is accessible to anyone. We have a notes field in those records where we record that there are handwritten recipes in a book. And our online cataloging systems have evolved to a degree of sophistication where you could probably do keyword searches to find all the books that have handwritten recipes in them. That would be the way to go about it, I think. And then you would have to, because they're not digitized, you would have to be able to come in person to study those. Because we can't digitize anything that is still under copyright. So currently the cutoff date is 1924, I think. And anything published after 1924, you have to be able to prove that it's an orphan publication, i.e. that there are no surviving copyright holders before you could digitize anything. So that kind of research is kind of research that will have to be put off until in-person research is possible again. But that would be a fascinating project. Okay.
And another question, does Schlesinger accept donations, or?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's how the Culinary collection grew to the size that it is today. And we still receive donations, absolutely, of both papers and books, and across all of our subject areas, not just the culinary.
Who should one contact? We have a question from an attendee. You, okay, well, we will make sure to.
For books, for published material, it's me, and I can forward other queries on to the appropriate curators. We have curator for visual collections. We have a curator for people's papers. We have a curator for race and ethnicity. We have a digital curator. So if you have digital, born digital materials, we have a curator for that also. So we have a whole team of curators who work with donors very closely and are always delighted to hear from donors. So thank you.
Well, the person who's asked, we can email your information to her.
Absolutely. Please feel free to share my email.
Although
I'm working from home, I'm connected to everybody in the library, and we're all keeping up our work remotely.
I think I covered all of the questions that came in.
I see the message here. There's someone commenting about Iowa State and their community cookbooks collection. Michigan State also has a very large collection, and they have digitized some of their earlier ones. Yeah, there are several really good, and University of Iowa as well. They have the Sophomari, or maybe it's Iowa State that has the Sophomari collection. One of the two of them got this big, huge collection. Yeah, there are a lot of good collections. We used to be the only show in town for decades, but we no longer are. There are many really good culinary collections around the country. And yes, I see Cornell and Hearth. Absolutely. Yes, that's a great collection.
Well, this has been really, really wonderful, especially timely.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry it was so long. I hope it was.
No, I think we all could have been for another hour. So it was really that fabulous. Thank you so much for your time.
You are welcome. And I send greetings to everyone in this time. And I know that a lot of people are cooking a lot at home right now. So that is maybe the only silver lining out there, but it's a good one. And keep cooking, keep eating well, and stay safe and sane. And thank you for allowing me to talk to you today.
Thank you all. Everybody, enjoy the rest of your day and take care.